Is Esther Renwick, who is a final year PhD student at Shetland College, who I've just met for the first time. I thought we would have met her before. I didn't realise that she was based there. But we will be in communication in the future. Yes. Her thesis is on the experience of space and place in the management of World Heritage. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And today she's going to talk about islands of significance. So, yeah, Esther, please.
Thank you. As Andrew said, I'm doing my PhD on the experience of space and place in World Heritage Site management. I'm particularly interested in these concepts of intangible heritage and authenticity as seen through visitor experience, which is something that UNESCO doesn't actually cover at the moment in its criteria. Its criteria of authenticity, as I'll expand on later, covers built authenticity as opposed to authenticity of experience. I'm going to be talking today about the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. This is one of my case studies. I've gone into a much wider depth than I'll cover here today. I'm mainly dealing with water, obviously, which is the theme of the conference. This was inscribed in 1989 for exceptional evidence of the domestic, ceremonial and burial practices of a now vanished 5,000-year-old culture. So we're back to the Neolithic again. For those of you who don't know it, do we have a pointer in here?
No, I think
that's all right. She's my novel. There's two sections to the World Heritage Site. There's Skara Brae up at the top, and Stennis and Brodgar down here. So you've got Skara Brae. Down here you've got a whole complex of monuments. Mace Howe is too short. Down at the bottom. Stones of Stennis. There's actually not marked on this map is the recently excavated nest of Brodgar in the middle, Ring of Brodgar at the top, and there's the Ring of Buchan beyond that. So there are a whole complex of Neolithic sites. The one I'm going to concentrate on talking about today is the Stennis Brodgar area. As I said before, the nest of Brodgar is actually here, but not marked on the map. This site has been very famous for many years, but has changed radically recently with the discovery of the nest of Brodgar. And what I'm going to talk through today is the comprehension of the experience of the site in the past from current academic thinking, and to compare it with the modern visitor experience with thoughts of authenticity in terms of whether it matters, whether the visitor should get an authentic experience or whether they do get anything resembling an authentic experience. And I'll discuss my use of the word authenticity later on. For those of you who don't know the site, there's a Ring of Brodgar, Stones of Stennis, Mace Howe, the Nest of Brodgar excavation, and Barnhouse Village, which is a settlement beside the Stones of Stennis. The academic narrative to do with this site is actually becoming increasingly connected with water. This is something that I wasn't covering particularly heavily in my thesis until I actually was looking at this conference and thinking, well, Silke originally suggested to me that I present, and I said, well, I don't do anything to do with maritime identity. And then I started looking at the academic narrative of this site and thought, actually, I do. It's just it's kind of the absence as opposed to the presence. The site is seen very heavily as being both wrapped and surrounded by water, and it's very important in the cosmological concepts of the way it's understood. Water, obviously, as is run through this conference, is a powerful elemental force. It's got the capacity to nurture or destroy. Most cultures regard water as something special and powerful. It's also been seen as, again, we've covered quite a lot here, as a metaphor of journeys and the passage of time. So it's not surprising that in the Neolithic there appears to be special consideration given to water. Life in Neolithic Orkney would have been intrinsically linked with water. It would have been virtually inescapable, the concept of water, because it was both a route way, at that point there were very few route ways through Orkney, and a source of food. If you look wider, the spread of Neolithic culture across Europe would have been impossible without active maritime communities. So it's absolutely built into the centre of life in Neolithic Orkney would have been these active water-based communities where boats would have been just as obvious a form of transport and communication as walking on land. The choice of the site itself is one of the few sites in Orkney that can be seen as being wrapped by water. It's got locks on both sides, and one is now a sea lock, but at the time it would have been fresh water because of the sea level change. It's wrapped by locks and it's wrapped by hills. It's a place of the elements and an important place that they chose to mark with these monuments. Henge monuments, which are these large ditched enclosures, and these have stone circles within them as well, are commonly found in association with water. There does seem to be a distinct link. And the ones in the heart of Neolithic Orkney appear to be deliberately wrapped in water as well as in stone. They have the ditches around them actually naturally, due to the water table, filled with water, and on excavation they found that almost all of these sites are actually filling up with water as quickly as you excavate them, the ditches. The presumption is, to do with the silt and evidence with silting found at Maes Howe, is that these were actually filled with water. And at Maes Howe, the second half of the ditch around the back isn't actually a proper ditch, it's just a low-lying area that also fills with water. So the important thing doesn't appear to be the ditch, the important thing is the water. We have to have water around it, even if it's not so much the surrounding of the ditch, it's the surrounding with water. The route from the Stones of Stennes to the Nesebrodga in the centre of the site is broken by water. You have to actually cross. What's now bridged would have actually been a short expanse of water you would have had to cross to get from one side to the other. So movement around this site would have been very governed by water. And when you come in from each side, it's arranged in such a way, it's been suggested, Gordon Noble suggested that it's arranged in such a way that it can be accessed not only by routeways, this is the main access into the west mainland of Orkney, so it is on, presumably at that time would have been on a route, but it's also accessible from the sea. The lock of Stennes would have been a freshwater lock, but would have been quite easy to portage a boat over the end, and so it's a very accessible site by land and by sea. So the importance of water I've kind of briefly covered at the site. I'll go on to the modern visitor experience. I've spent some time at all of my case studies, this being one of them, observing movement of people and doing interviews to get an idea of the visitor experience at the site. It's set up with expectations of an emotional and imaginative experience. I mean, I'm sure you can read these for yourselves, but everywhere you see it, it's like this description on the bottom. It's the wild, wind-blasted setting, and they're supposed to be. The sound, light, and smell amplifies the visitor experience just as they did 5 millennia ago. It's very much built up to be a very emotional, powerful experience to do with the imagination. However, often when you actually get to the monument, the encounter is quite different. The top picture is a coach tour from a cruise ship, and they had 5 minutes at the Stones of Stennes. The first 2 were the guide, and then they had 3 minutes to take photographs. The others are varying sort of private visitors. I'm not going to go into the movement at the various sites today, because I'm looking more at the concepts of the visitors' responses to the sites, but certainly there is a different sort of response to the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stennes, as you can see at the bottom picture with them pretending to push over the Stones of Stennes. The Stones of Stennes appears to be much more accessible. People seem to hug the stones, kick the stones, pose by the stones for photographs. It seems to be a much more informal site, but I'm not going to cover that particularly now. Ring of Brodgar is probably lends itself to being a little bit more formal. You're not allowed to the centre of circle. There's a bigger perception of control going on with movement, and you can't really see the picture at the bottom, but that's the Historic Scotland Ranger tour that goes around both sites and gives you a good insight into the current archaeological interpretations. But other than that, the interpretation on the site is there's one semicircular panel at the Ring of Brodgar and 3 individual small panels at Sailscapes. The Nessa Brodgar has about 4 panels, I think. So there's the interpretation, if you don't get a guided tour, is the standard sort of historic Scotland panels. To look at the patterns of movement, in the past, this gives you a better idea of what I was talking about before. The current interpretation is that movement was funneled into the Nessa Brodgar here as the ceremonial centre, funneled into the Ring of Brodgar, up through the stones of Sennes, or into the locks. So in this picture, now the water aspect, the water becomes a barrier. The water is the inaccessible areas. The visitors are moving down this road here, and I observed 2 patterns of movement, basically, broadly speaking. People either start at the Ring of Brodgar and go that way, or they start at the Stones of Sennes and go that way. And they just go 1, 2, 3 and go up to all the sites. The Ring of Buchan is very rarely visited. I've only seen one person there in all the time that I've been there, and he was a cyclist having his lunch. So I'm not sure whether he really counts. And he must have been interested enough to choose to go and have his lunch there. But the Mace Hound tends to be visited separately because you have to pre-book, so that gives a slightly different concept on there. But the movement is very much tick box, do one site, do the next site. Sometimes the Nessa Brodgar will be visited in a slightly different order because people seem less aware of it. So sometimes they'd say to me they've driven past, seen it, and then when they've done the Stones of Sennes or Nessa Brodgar, or Ring of Brodgar, whichever way they were going, they'd double back and do the Nessa Brodgar afterwards. A few people I spoke to said that they'd done the Nessa Brodgar and then clarified that they'd actually driven past, slowed down as they drove past and seen there was an excavation. And that apparently counted as being done. There was very much a tick box attitude going on here with doing the Heart of Neolithic Orkney. The normal pattern was to do this in the morning and Scarborough in the afternoon. So this was a standard sort of behaviour going on. And so, just to capture some of the visitor responses, I carried out interviews. I've also trawled through TripAdvisor to look at reviews. I was looking at short interviews, short reviews on TripAdvisor to get a concept of the general feeling that people were taking away from this. It's very positive, and it tallies very, very well with the advertising. It's all awesome and impressive and spiritual and moving and occasionally interesting, but old. But it's very much, it fits very well with the way it's sold to be very, very impressive and or inspiring place to come. But what's been missing, this happened with all of my interviews and the TripAdvisor ones, the people. We appear to have an uninhabited monument as far as I could see from my results. Where were the people? They never referred. Well, I think of my interviews I had 2 sets of people I interviewed that actually mentioned humans in some concept. One of whom did actually obviously understood the site a little bit better and said that he could understand that the settlement in the bottom of the valley would be a logical place to settle, and obviously this has had some significance to the beliefs of people there, we wouldn't know what. The other one said, well, they were hunter-gatherers, weren't they? They weren't, but they were hunter-gatherers. What did they do but have hunt and build stone circles? So they kind of filled their spare time with stone circle building. So we very much seem to be missing the people behind this, but we're also missing the people in the way it's sold to people. It's very much an awe-inspiring, impressive monument. The impression I got was you go to Scarborough to see the people. You go to the Ring of Brodgar, to see the stones. And people would explain to me that they'd understand about life in the Neolithic when they'd been to Scarborough, but they hadn't been to Scarborough yet, so they couldn't tell me. Invariably. And so it seemed to be this whole expectation, you did the whole thing as a package, and Scarborough would tell you about people, and this didn't have people, it just stones. So the other thing that was entirely missing, even more missing than the people, was the water. Nobody mentioned water in any capacity. They didn't mention the locks, they didn't mention the sea, they didn't mention how they'd accessed the site, they didn't mention the site in the past. What they did, though, mention was, and what came up was that it was remote, inaccessible, primitive, wild. You got this idea of a very, very liminal place where people were scratching, and there was a couple of references on TripAdvisor where they were talking about sort of people scratching survival at the edge of the sort of no world almost. Where in fact there's a very strong suggestion going on in archaeology at the moment that in fact the Neolithic culture actually spread from the north to the south. So in fact these predate Stonehenge. So in fact this is not a very liminal edge of empire sort of place where people scratch a living. This is in fact somewhere where people are actually doing quite well for themselves, and actually they do have the capacity to create a monument. They have the social organisation to be able to go and make the decision to do this. And the water is very vital. They're not in fact cut off. They can't be cut off. The spread of Neolithic culture suggests that they are right in the middle of things. So the experience that they appear to be taking away is actually very different from what's going on in the current academic narrative. But does it matter? They're all having a good time. Everyone said they're having a good time. They're having a great time. And they always come back, and there's a massive amount of visitor numbers, and we have problems with erosion because there's so many people who want to come and see it. So, does it really matter? Well, it's a World Heritage Site. World Heritage Sites have to be inscribed, have to prove that they're authentic. Authenticity, however, is classed in physical terms. These sites are considered to be authentic because of their actual structure. They have enough of the original fabric surviving without too many modern intrusions, or in this case, virtually no modern intrusions. So they are ticked authentic. However, UNESCO and the World Heritage Convention increasingly recently talk about intangible heritage and the spirit of place, and they are very much saying that part of when a site's described now, it has to have a feeling, a spirit. But then they leave it. That's all they say. So my argument is that while the visitors are expecting what Joe just calls an aura of authenticity, and they're getting an aura of authenticity because it's awesome and it's impressive, is this actually enough for a World Heritage Site to say that it's fine, the spirit and feeling is good, we like it, but actually the authenticity they're getting is a construct, largely in their own heads, to be honest. It's a construct that they've been fed by the tourism, and they've been fed by their own expectations. I found this with my other case studies as well. It's not purely Orkney. I'm also studying housesteads on Hadrian's Wall and Durham Castle and Cathedral, because I'm going for totally different sort of World Heritage Sites. And they have their own aura of authenticity as well, and they will feed you. The visitors will come with their stereotypes, and they will leave with their stereotypes invariably. And this aura of authenticity is very powerful, but I think it's arguable that in a World Heritage Site, perhaps we need to examine this a little more closely and see whether we just need an aura of authenticity or whether we need to make a little bit more effort to try and make it slightly more specific. My suggestion is that within academic archaeology and related disciplines, this spreads across all the social sciences, there's been a lot of work recently within phenomenology and related disciplines, emphasising movement, sensory experience, commonality of human experience, our thinking through the body. The fact that we still have a body the same as they did. We have different cultural constructs, but we still have a body, and we can still hear things, see things, smell things, we can move around. We still can experience architecture. We may not have the cultural baggage that's needed that relates to that particular one, but with a bit of help, we can still experience it. It relates to it in a similar way. So my suggestion is that if this is going on, it has its critics, but it's accepted academic archaeology and anthropology and ethnography and all the rest of them. Then, if this can be applied across to heritage management, and we can think, instead of going, okay, what have we got to interpret here? We've got a certain amount of data, if it's a World Heritage Site, we've got statements of significance, these are the things, tick, 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 that's significant about it. Take those away a little bit, and think first about what the experience of the site was like in the past, and how people moved and used the spaces in the past. Then, think about that first, think about the way people moved around, think about the way the landscapes worked, the wider picture, then apply the rest of the information you need. Perhaps we could arm people, instead of them having, they're trying to imagine what life was like, but they haven't got very much ammunition to do it with. And so they tend to come up with stereotypes. The other thing that I got the impression of, people were a little bit reluctant to talk to me about people, I think, at Orkney also because I think they had the impression that these weren't cavemen, but they weren't sure who they were. They didn't really enter into the sort of, they knew quite well they didn't live in caves and go, oh, but that was about, they knew they weren't allowed to say that was wrong, but they weren't entirely sure where we'd actually got to. So I think when you look at this, you class the intangible experience along these lines, because this is the intangible stuff, not the data and not the dates and not the actual building, the sensory experience on the site of the past, which gives you a sense of, my argument would be that your sense of place should be based more on this sort of thing than on the modern stereotypes that people are coming and expectations people are coming with, that we should try and create a feeling that is based upon an actual past experience, or at least a conceptualization of a past experience. This is, as I say, I'm final year, so I'm just in the middle of writing this up, but it's alright, I'm almost done, I'm actually ahead of time. I'm trying to bring together totally different sites to see how this works across. I've collected all my data, obviously I'm writing up, how this works across totally different types of World Heritage sites, to try and argue that this emphasis on things like this brings in things like an Orkney that's been forgotten, like water, like the access, this fact that this was a centre, this wasn't a remote liminal place, this was actually a centre of culture and a centre of trade and movement. Things like this are tending to get overlooked, certainly by the public, when they're actually coming away from it. And so I feel that if we want to give, we can't necessarily give much better than an aura of authenticity, but at least we can try and make sure our aura of authenticity is as authentic as we can get it. And so if we can combine these together, that will give us a good try at getting a slightly more authentic experience. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. Excellent. This idea of authenticity, what's the line in the famous quote from one of the film? The truth. You can't handle the truth. I mean, how much? What do you mean by authenticity? And,
I kind of skipped over it because it's kind of how many hours we've got. But I think my concept of authenticity, I'm basing on the World Heritage Convention's concept of authenticity, in that they are taking a very traditional view of authenticity in terms of they are going for sort of literal authenticity. My view, I'm defining it in terms of what the current academic narrative is and get the closest we can to the current academic narrative of the experience of place at that site. However, I mean, if you took a postmodern view on this, you could just say, well, they're having a great time, and they're going. So, what's the problem? Why fix it? It's doing really well. That's why the key is the World Heritage designation, because that does give sort of responsibility in its literature. It needs to have a thing, at least, before it says things like authentic.
Thank you very much. Right?
I found that very interesting, but I wasn't entirely clear from what you said where these grotesque ideas are coming from. Who is expanding these sites?
In the archaeological, the archaeological side, or the sorry.
Well,
do you mean that
the popular perception of them? Where are the popular ideas coming?
Oh, you think in terms of that the public are actually picking the ideas up from? I think it's a combination. I think quite a lot comes from certainly having looked at the other sites, quite a lot comes from people's education. They're much happier with sites that are my other sites, you have to give me, are English, so I'm talking about the national curriculum here. Sites that are covered in the national curriculum, people are much happier with. So they're much happier with Romans and Tudors, and they understand that. The Neolithic kind of doesn't come into the school education. So you do see a bit of a gap, I think, there. The other thing that one person did mention to me that they'd seen Neil Oliver's programme on the Nessa Brodgar, and they were certainly much more informed about that sort of thing. So I think there's obviously a certain amount of popular TV coming out, but again, the Neolithic's not a particularly heavily covered time period on television. To give you an idea, on my Roman example, it's slightly difficult with this because he basically didn't mention the people, so it's kind of I think their expectations here did come a lot from the marketing, because they are sold these as wild and sort of other and dramatic, so I think they do come from that. There were also references back to Stonehenge. Quite a lot of them were interested in how they erected the stones. Academically, we're not particularly interested in how they erected the stones. We know how they erected, or fairly confident how they erected the stones. It's not really a big mystery. But the public are still hooked on this Stonehenge idea of how on earth did they erect the stones. So again, popular culture through television and through books and things over the last sort of few years. I think that a lot of it, you see them being a few years behind, you know, everything was sort of a few years behind. They're understandably a few years behind the academic perception. But certainly on the Roman side, they were very much seeing freezing Roman soldiers with short silhouettes and sandals. They, despite the fact that in the museum there's a fully clothed Roman soldier with his trousers and his socks and his boots on, they still told me about these freezing Roman soldiers that were up on the wall, isolated and liminal. They do like these sites to be very liminal and isolated.
Yeah, we've got one last question here.
Thanks. I thought that was a really interesting presentation. And I wondered if, as part of your data interviews with, for example, Historic Scotland officers, if so, how receptive or defensive have they been to your analysis?
It's not actually at the moment, but I'm in conversation with Historic Scotland, I'm in conversation with the World Heritage Coordinator at Orkney and the other sites. I'm in conversation with the Head of Interpretation at Historic Scotland. We are at the moment, in that level, they're very happy. They're just wanting the data. They just like to, they just want to see what I come up with and see whether I haven't really had a problem. I have to say, though, I do approach it fairly sympathetically when I approach them, because I've actually done the job, and so I do know that there's huge constraints. One of the things I haven't got, this has been a very kind of whistle-stop version of it. I do know, one of the things I'm very keen on is that this can be done, thoughts of movement and access and things can be done very, very low budget and very unintrusively. It doesn't necessarily, the solution doesn't necessarily have to be very high-tech and very expensive and very, very difficult for the. But so far, no, I really haven't had a problem. But whether it's because I do approach them as having been a practitioner myself, whether that helps.
Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you very much indeed.